What happens when a federal judge believes his black robes make him untouchable, and the one prosecutor bold enough to challenge his authority refuses to bow down? Tonight, you're about to witness a courtroom showdown that will redefine the meaning of judicial accountability as Attorney General Sarah Mitchell faces off against Judge Marcus Wellington in a confrontation that exposes decades of hidden corruption, backdoor deals, and the shocking abuse of power that has infected our justice system at its highest levels. If you think the scales of justice are balanced, prepare to see them shattered as Mitchell unleashes evidence so damning that it will leave reputations in ruins and force an entire federal district to confront the truth they've spent years trying to bury. This isn't just another legal dispute. This is the moment when courage meets corruption head-on, and only one side will emerge with their integrity intact. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The amber glow of emergency lighting cast long shadows across the empty corridors of the Thurgood Marshall Federal Courthouse as the clock struck 11:30 on a Tuesday night in late October. The building, normally silent after hours save for the distant hum of ventilation systems, now buzzed with an energy that felt almost electric. Security guards patrolled with heightened alertness, their footsteps echoing against polished marble floors that had witnessed decades of legal drama, but nothing quite like what was about to unfold. In the secure elevator ascending to the 15th floor, Attorney General Sarah Mitchell stood with her shoulders squared and her jaws set in determination. Her briefcase, unusually heavy this evening, contained documents that had been sealed under federal protection for the past 6 months. The manila folders within were marked with red classifications and bore the kind of official stamps that indicated their contents could topple careers and destroy reputations with surgical precision. Mitchell had spent the better part of 3 years building this case, following a trail of evidence that led from street-level corruption all the way to the mahogany-paneled chambers of one of the most powerful federal judges in the district. Judge Marcus Wellington had ruled from his bench for over 2 decades, building a reputation as a no-nonsense jurist who commanded absolute respect from prosecutors, defense attorneys, and court staff alike. His decisions rarely faced successful appeals, his courtroom ran with military efficiency, and his influence extended far beyond the confines of his judicial district. What the legal community didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that Wellington had spent years manipulating case assignments, influencing sentencing recommendations, and accepting payments from a network of attorneys who understood that the right financial contribution could ensure favorable outcomes for their clients. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Mitchell stepped into the hallway where her security detail waited. 2 federal marshals flanked her as she walked toward the conference room where Wellington had demanded this emergency meeting. The judge had issued the summons through official channels, using language that bordered on threatening as he cited his authority to compel her appearance for what he termed a discussion of prosecutorial overreach and inappropriate investigation tactics. Mitchell knew better. This wasn't about procedure or protocol. This was about power, intimidation, and a desperate attempt to silence an investigation that had grown too close to the truth. The heavy oak doors of conference room 1547 stood slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of the scene within. Wellington sat at the head of a polished conference table, still wearing his judicial robes despite the late hour, as if the black fabric could somehow shield him from the reckoning that was approaching. His face, normally composed and authoritative, showed the first signs of strain around his eyes and the tight line of his mouth. Beside him sat his personal attorney, a high-powered defense lawyer named Richard Blackstone, who specialized in representing public officials caught in ethical scandals. The presence of outside counsel spoke volumes about Wellington's awareness of his precarious position. Mitchell entered the room without hesitation, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she approached the table. She set her briefcase down with deliberate care, the sound echoing in the tense silence that filled the space between them. Wellington gestured toward a chair across from him, but Mitchell remained standing, her posture radiating the confidence of someone who held all the cards and intended to play them strategically. The judge cleared his throat and launched into what sounded like a prepared statement, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he used from the bench when addressing unruly defendants. He spoke of judicial independence, the separation of powers, and the dangerous precedent that would be set if prosecutors were allowed to pursue politically motivated investigations against sitting federal judges. His words were carefully chosen, designed to sound principled and constitutional, but Mitchell could hear the underlying desperation in his tone. This was a man who understood that his world was about to collapse, and he was making one final attempt to control the narrative before the truth became undeniable. Mitchell listened without interruption, her expression unreadable as Wellington continued his monologue about the sanctity of the judicial system and the need to protect the courts from external interference. When he finally paused, expecting some form of response or negotiation, Mitchell reached for her briefcase and extracted the first of many folders that would define the remainder of this confrontation. She placed it on the table between them and opened it to reveal a series of bank statements, each one highlighting deposits that coincided with specific case assignments and sentencing decisions from Wellington's court. The silence that followed was deafening. Wellington's face went pale as he recognized the financial records that Mitchell had somehow obtained, despite multiple court orders sealing them from public view. Blackstone leaned forward, attempting to examine the documents, but Mitchell's hand moved to cover them before he could get a clear look. This evidence would be revealed on her terms, in her time frame, and according to her strategic plan. Mitchell's voice, when she finally spoke, cut through the tension like a blade. She had not come here to negotiate or to be intimidated by judicial authority. She had come to deliver a message that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in this room and potentially throughout the entire federal district. Her investigation had uncovered a pattern of corruption so extensive and so carefully orchestrated that it implicated not just Wellington, but a network of court officials, private attorneys, and political figures who had treated the justice system as their personal financial playground. The first document she presented detailed a case from 3 years earlier involving a prominent real estate developer who had been charged with federal tax evasion. The charges should have resulted in significant prison time and financial penalties, but Wellington had inexplicably reduced the sentence to probation and community service. What the public didn't know, what even the prosecuting attorneys hadn't discovered, was that the developer's legal team had arranged for a substantial contribution to a charitable foundation that Wellington had established ostensibly to support legal education for underprivileged students. The foundation, as Mitchell's investigation had revealed, was little more than a personal slush fund that Wellington used to finance luxury travel, high-end accommodations, and expensive dinners that bore no resemblance to legitimate charitable activities. Wellington attempted to interrupt, citing attorney-client privilege and the confidential nature of judicial deliberations, but Mitchell pressed on relentlessly. She produced a second folder containing email correspondence between Wellington's personal assistant and representatives of various law firms, messages that discussed case scheduling, judicial preferences, and the importance of maintaining positive relationships with the court. The language was coded, carefully crafted to avoid explicit mention of financial arrangements, but the pattern was unmistakable to anyone who understood how corruption operated at the highest levels of government. The room's atmosphere grew increasingly suffocating as Mitchell methodically laid out piece after piece of evidence. She had traced money flows through multiple bank accounts, documented patterns of case assignments that defied statistical probability, and identified a systematic approach to judicial misconduct that had been operating for years under the noses of federal oversight agencies. What made her investigation particularly devastating was its scope. This wasn't a case of isolated incidents or occasional lapses in judgment. This was evidence of a comprehensive scheme that had corrupted dozens of cases and affected the lives of countless defendants who had appeared in Wellington's courtroom expecting impartial justice. Blackstone finally found his voice, objecting to what he characterized as a prosecutorial fishing expedition based on circumstantial evidence and speculation. His words carried the practiced confidence of a defense attorney who had successfully defended powerful clients in similar situations, but his tone betrayed an underlying nervousness that Mitchell didn't miss. She responded by producing the third folder, this one containing something that neither Wellington nor his attorney had expected: recorded conversations. The recordings had been obtained through a federal wiretap authorization that Mitchell had secured after months of patient legal maneuvering. The conversations captured Wellington discussing case outcomes with individuals who had no official business being involved in judicial deliberations. In one particularly damaging exchange, the judge could be heard expressing concern about a prosecutor who was asking too many questions about sentencing disparities in his court. The voice on the other end of the call reassured Wellington that the problem could be managed through appropriate channels, suggesting that Mitchell's own career could be derailed if she continued to pursue her investigation too aggressively. The revelation of the recordings transformed the dynamic in the room completely. Wellington, who had entered this meeting believing he could intimidate Mitchell into backing down, now found himself confronting evidence that could not be explained away through legal technicalities or procedural objections. His face flushed red as he realized the full implications of what Mitchell possessed. These weren't just financial records or suspicious patterns. These were his own words, captured on federal recording equipment, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that he had engaged in corrupt practices that violated every ethical standard governing judicial conduct. Mitchell allowed the weight of the recordings to settle over the room before she continued her presentation. She had documented not just Wellington's corruption, but the entire ecosystem that had enabled it to flourish. Court clerks had been paid to provide advance notice of case assignments. Bailiffs had received bonuses for reporting on the activities of prosecutors and defense attorneys. Even some federal marshals had been compromised, providing security information that allowed Wellington's network to monitor and influence ongoing investigations. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking in its audacity and sophistication. Wellington had essentially created a parallel justice system where outcomes were predetermined based on financial considerations rather than legal merit. Defendants with resources and connections received favorable treatment, while those without such advantages faced the full force of judicial authority. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The recordings captured Wellington boasting about his ability to influence not just his own court, but to affect case assignments and judicial decisions throughout the district through his relationships with other judges and court administrators. As Mitchell continued to present her evidence, Wellington's composure began to crack visibly. The man who had spent decades projecting an image of unassailable judicial authority now looked like what he truly was: a corrupt official whose carefully constructed facade was crumbling under the weight of irrefutable evidence. His attempts to maintain dignity through legal objections and procedural challenges fell flat as Mitchell demonstrated the breadth and depth of her investigation. Blackstone made several desperate attempts to regain control of the situation, threatening legal action against Mitchell for what he characterized as an illegal investigation based on improperly obtained evidence. His threats rang hollow in the face of the meticulous legal work that Mitchell had conducted over the past 3 years. Every wiretap had been properly authorized. Every financial record had been obtained through legitimate legal channels. and every piece of evidence had been carefully documented to withstand the most rigorous legal scrutiny. The most devastating revelation came when Mitchell produced evidence that Wellington had not only accepted bribes and manipulated case outcomes, but had actively worked to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses who might have exposed his corrupt practices. The recordings captured him discussing strategies for discrediting prosecutors who asked uncomfortable questions, methods for pressuring defense attorneys to avoid certain legal arguments, and techniques for ensuring that potentially damaging information never reached appellate courts or federal oversight agencies. Wellington's network had extended beyond the courthouse walls to include political figures, law enforcement officials, and business leaders who understood that maintaining good relationships with a corrupt federal judge could provide significant advantages in their own professional endeavors. The judge had leveraged his position to build a web of mutual obligation and financial benefit that had operated successfully for years, because no one had been willing to challenge someone with such apparent power and institutional protection. Mitchell's investigation had required extraordinary courage and persistence, because Wellington's corruption had been protected by the very system that was supposed to prevent it. Other prosecutors had been transferred or reassigned when they got too close to the truth. Federal agents who asked uncomfortable questions found their careers stalled or derailed. Witnesses who might have provided crucial testimony were intimidated into silence or discredited through coordinated campaigns of character assassination. The room fell silent as Mitchell concluded her presentation, the weight of the evidence hanging heavy in the air between them. Wellington sat motionless, his face ashen as he contemplated the destruction of everything he had built over 2 decades on the federal bench. Blackstone shuffled through papers frantically, searching for some legal theory or procedural argument that might provide an escape route for his client, but finding nothing that could overcome the comprehensive nature of Mitchell's case. The confrontation had reached its climax, but Mitchell wasn't finished. She had one final revelation that would ensure Wellington understood the full scope of his exposure and the inevitability of his downfall. The investigation had uncovered evidence that Wellington's corruption had resulted in wrongful convictions, inappropriate sentences, and the systematic denial of justice to defendants who had appeared in his court expecting impartial treatment. The human cost of his actions extended far beyond financial impropriety to include destroyed lives, broken families, and a fundamental betrayal of the oath he had taken when he first assumed judicial office. As the clock approached midnight in that austere conference room, the balance of power had shifted completely. Wellington, who had summoned Mitchell with the intention of intimidating her into abandoning her investigation, now found himself facing the inevitable consequences of years of corrupt conduct. The evidence was overwhelming, the legal authority was clear, and the political will to pursue justice had been demonstrated through Mitchell's unwavering commitment to the truth. The stage was set for a confrontation that would extend far beyond this midnight meeting, reaching into courtrooms, newspaper headlines, and the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Wellington's attempt at intimidation had backfired spectacularly, transforming what he had hoped would be a private negotiation into the beginning of his very public downfall. Mitchell had turned the tables completely, and the reverberations of this moment would be felt throughout the justice system for years to come. The morning sun cast stark shadows through the towering windows of the federal courthouse as news of the midnight confrontation began to ripple through the legal community like wildfire. Within hours of Mitchell's devastating presentation, encrypted messages flew between law firms, judicial chambers, and government offices as Wellington's network scrambled to assess the damage and protect their own interests. The carefully constructed web of corruption that had operated in shadows for over 2 decades was suddenly exposed to the harsh light of federal scrutiny, and the panic was palpable among those who had benefited from the judge's influence. In her downtown office overlooking the city's financial district, Mitchell worked through the early morning hours with her core team of federal prosecutors and investigators. The conference room buzzed with controlled urgency as evidence technicians organized thousands of documents into prosecutable categories, while forensic accountants traced. Money flows through an increasingly complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The scope of Wellington's operation was becoming clearer with each hour of analysis, revealing a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had generated millions of dollars in illicit profits while systematically corrupting the administration of justice. Special Agent Victoria Reynolds, the lead FBI investigator assigned to the case, spread aerial photographs across the conference table showing properties that Wellington owned through various holding companies. The judge's official financial disclosures had listed his net worth as modest, consistent with a federal salary and conservative investments. But the investigation had uncovered luxury homes in 3 states, a yacht moored in the Bahamas, and art collections worth more than most federal judges earned in a lifetime. The discrepancy between his reported income and actual wealth was so dramatic that it provided clear evidence of systematic financial fraud that extended far beyond simple bribery. The first cracks in Wellington's network appeared before noon, when his personal assistant, Margaret Chun, arrived at the courthouse to find federal agents waiting in her office with a search warrant. Chun had worked for Wellington for 15 years, managing his calendar, screening his calls, and coordinating the complex logistics that allowed his corrupt operation to function smoothly. She had always believed that her loyalty would be rewarded and protected, but the sight of agents methodically cataloging every document and electronic device in her workspace shattered that illusion completely. Within minutes of the search beginning, Chun's attorney was on the phone demanding explanations and threatening legal action. But the federal agents worked with the calm efficiency of professionals who understood they were executing legally bulletproof warrants. Mitchell had spent months ensuring that every aspect of the investigation would withstand the most aggressive legal challenges, and the warrants were so comprehensive and well documented that even Wellington's most skilled defense attorneys would find no procedural grounds for suppression. The psychological pressure on Wellington's network intensified throughout the morning as news of the investigation spread through the legal community. Court clerks who had accepted payments for providing insider information suddenly found themselves unable to concentrate on their duties, jumping at every unexpected phone call and avoiding eye contact with their supervisors. Bailiffs who had been compromised by Wellington's operation called in sick rather than face questions about their activities, while federal marshals who had provided security information to the corrupt network began consulting with their union representatives about potential criminal exposure. At precisely 10:30, Mitchell held an emergency press conference in the marble lobby of the federal courthouse, surrounded by representatives from the FBI, the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The assembled media had been buzzing with rumors since dawn, but nothing had prepared them for the scope and audacity of the corruption that Mitchell was about to reveal. Television crews jostled for position while print reporters prepared to file stories that would dominate national headlines for weeks to come. Mitchell's opening statement was delivered with the precision of a prosecutor who understood the historical significance of the moment. She announced that a federal grand jury had been investigating judicial corruption in the district for over 3 years, following credible allegations that sitting federal judges had accepted bribes, manipulated case assignments, and systematically denied justice to defendants who appeared in their courtrooms. The investigation had uncovered evidence of a criminal conspiracy that had operated at the highest levels of the federal judiciary, generating millions of dollars in illicit profits while corrupting dozens of criminal and civil cases. The press conference erupted with questions as reporters struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the allegations. Mitchell fielded inquiries about the scope of the investigation, the number of judges involved, and the potential impact on pending cases with the calm authority of someone who had anticipated every possible question. She confirmed that Judge Marcus Wellington was the primary target of the investigation, but indicated that additional indictments were likely as the probe continued to expand. The revelation that sparked the most intense media interest came when Mitchell disclosed that the investigation had uncovered evidence of witness intimidation, jury tampering, and the destruction of evidence that should have been preserved under federal law. Wellington's corruption had not been limited to accepting bribes and manipulating sentences. He had actively worked to obstruct justice and prevent the discovery of his criminal activities. The recordings that Mitchell had played during the midnight confrontation were just a small sample of the evidence that federal investigators had gathered over 3 years of patient surveillance and investigation. As news of the press conference spread across social media and cable news networks, the reaction from the legal community was swift and devastating for Wellington's remaining supporters. Bar associations that had previously honored the judge with awards and recognition began distancing themselves from his legacy, while law schools that had invited him to speak as a distinguished jurist quietly removed references to his lectures from their websites. The corruption scandal was not just destroying Wellington's career. It was forcing an entire professional community to confront uncomfortable questions about how such systematic misconduct had gone undetected for so long. In his chambers, Wellington watched the press conference coverage with growing horror as the full scope of Mitchell's investigation became public knowledge. The evidence that she had presented during their midnight confrontation was now being broadcast to millions of viewers, and the careful reputation that he had built over 2 decades was evaporating in real time. His personal phone rang continuously, with calls from reporters, colleagues, and political figures who demanded explanations that he could not provide without incriminating himself further. Blackstone worked frantically to develop a defense strategy that might salvage something from the wreckage of Wellington's career. But the comprehensiveness of Mitchell's investigation made traditional legal defenses almost impossible to pursue. The recorded conversations eliminated any possibility of denying the corrupt activities, while the financial evidence made claims of innocent explanations completely untenable. Even a plea bargain would require Wellington to admit to federal crimes that would result in decades of imprisonment and the forfeiture of virtually all his assets. The most damaging revelation of the day came when Mitchell announced that the investigation had identified specific cases where Wellington's corruption had resulted in wrongful convictions and inappropriate sentences. Federal prosecutors were already reviewing dozens of criminal cases to determine which defendants might have been denied due process because of Wellington's illegal activities, and the process was expected to result in numerous appeals, retrials, and sentence reductions. The human cost of Wellington's corruption was becoming clear, and the impact on the justice system would be felt for years to come. By early afternoon, the first of Wellington's co-conspirators had begun to crack under the pressure of federal scrutiny. Thomas Meridian, a prominent defense attorney who had built his career on his supposedly exceptional ability to secure favorable outcomes in Wellington's court, arrived at the FBI field office with his attorney and a proffer letter outlining his willingness to cooperate with the ongoing investigation. Meridian had realized that his involvement with Wellington's criminal network made him a prime target for federal prosecution, and his decision to cooperate represented the first major breach in the wall of silence that had protected the corruption for so long. The proffer session with Meridian lasted for over 6 hours as federal investigators methodically extracted details about the operation of Wellington's network. The defense attorney described the sophisticated system where case assignments were influenced through payments to court personnel, where judicial decisions were essentially purchased through contributions to Wellington's charitable foundation, and where witnesses and prosecutors who posed threats to the network were systematically intimidated or discredited. Meridian's cooperation provided federal investigators with insider knowledge of how the corruption operated at ground level, filling in crucial details that would be necessary for successful prosecutions. The psychological warfare that had characterized Wellington's response to threatening investigations was revealed in shocking detail during Meridian's debriefing. The judge had maintained files on prosecutors, defense attorneys, and court personnel that contained personal information, financial details, and compromising material that could be used for blackmail when necessary. Federal agents who got too close to the truth found themselves transferred to less desirable assignments, while prosecutors who asked uncomfortable questions discovered that their cases were suddenly reassigned to less cooperative judges. The scope of Wellington's influence extended far beyond his own courtroom to include manipulation of case assignments throughout the federal district. Through his relationships with chief judges and court administrators, Wellington had been able to ensure that sensitive cases involving his co-conspirators were assigned to sympathetic judges, while prosecutors who posed threats to the network found their cases directed to courts where they would face maximum resistance. The systematic corruption of the case assignment process represented a fundamental assault on the principle of random judicial selection that was supposed to ensure fairness in the federal court system. As evening approached, the first round of additional arrests began as federal agents moved simultaneously against multiple targets throughout the city. The coordinated operation was designed to prevent the destruction of evidence and limit the ability of conspirators to coordinate their defense strategies, and the timing was carefully calculated to maximize media coverage and public impact. Local television stations interrupted regular programming to broadcast live footage of federal agents executing search warrants at the homes and offices of prominent attorneys and court officials who had been identified as part of Wellington's network. The arrest of Deputy Court Administrator Harold Fisher sent shockwaves through the courthouse as federal agents led him away in handcuffs while his colleagues watched in stunned silence. Fisher had been responsible for managing case assignments and court schedules for over a decade, and his cooperation with Wellington's network had been crucial to the success of the corrupt operation. His arrest signaled that federal investigators understood exactly how the criminal conspiracy had functioned and were prepared to prosecute everyone who had played a significant role in its operation. The media coverage of the expanding investigation dominated news cycles across the country as legal experts and political commentators struggled to analyze the implications of such systematic judicial corruption. Cable news networks featured hour-long special reports examining how the federal judiciary's internal oversight mechanisms had failed to detect such extensive criminal activity, while newspaper editorial boards called for comprehensive reforms to prevent similar corruption in the future. The scandal was being compared to historic episodes of government corruption, and the political ramifications were beginning to extend far beyond the immediate participants. Mitchell's strategic decision to make the investigation public through a comprehensive press conference rather than allowing details to leak out gradually had achieved its intended effect of controlling the narrative and preventing Wellington's network from mounting an effective defense. By revealing the scope and sophistication of the corruption all at once, she had made it impossible for individual conspirators to minimize their own involvement or claim ignorance of the broader criminal enterprise. The shock value of the simultaneous revelations had overwhelmed the defense strategies that Wellington's attorneys had been developing, forcing them into a reactive posture from which recovery would be virtually impossible. The first indication that Wellington's position was completely untenable came when the Chief Judge of the Federal Circuit issued a statement announcing that Wellington would be immediately suspended from all judicial duties pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. The administrative suspension was accompanied by the assignment of a special master to review all of Wellington's recent decisions for evidence of corruption or bias, a process that was expected to result in the reversal of numerous convictions and the ordering of new trials for defendants who had been denied due process. In law firms throughout the city, partners held emergency meetings to assess their own exposure to the expanding investigation, while associates worked through the night to review case files for any evidence of involvement with Wellington's network. The corruption scandal had created a cloud of suspicion over the entire legal community, and firms that had achieved unusual success in Wellington's court found themselves facing uncomfortable questions from clients, regulators, and professional oversight bodies. The human impact of Wellington's corruption became more apparent as defense attorneys began filing motions on behalf of clients who had been sentenced in his court, arguing that the systematic corruption had denied their clients the right to a fair trial. The Federal Public Defender's Office announced that it would be reviewing every case that had appeared before Wellington in the past 5 years, potentially affecting hundreds of convictions and thousands of sentences. The cost of addressing the corruption would extend far beyond the criminal prosecution of the conspirators to include years of appellate litigation and the retrial of cases where defendants had been denied due process. As the day ended, Wellington found himself completely isolated, abandoned by allies who now viewed association with him as a career-ending liability. His chambers, once a center of power and influence, had become a prison where he waited for the inevitable federal indictment that would formally end his judicial career and begin his transformation from a respected federal judge to a federal defendant facing decades of imprisonment. The midnight confrontation with Mitchell had been the beginning of his downfall, but the public revelation of his corruption had sealed his fate completely. The investigation that Mitchell had pursued with such determination and courage was now a matter of public record, and the evidence of systematic judicial corruption was available for all to see. Wellington's attempt to intimidate her into abandoning the probe had backfired spectacularly, accelerating the timeline for public disclosure and ensuring that his criminal activities would be exposed under the harshest possible spotlight. The tables had been turned completely, and the judge who had once wielded absolute power in his courtroom was now powerless to prevent the inevitable consequences of his own criminal choices. The federal courthouse erupted into chaos as news crews surrounded the building while inside. Emergency judicial sessions convened to address the constitutional crisis created by Wellington's systematic corruption. Chief Circuit Judge Patricia Morrison found herself managing the most serious judicial scandal in the district's history as she worked to implement emergency protocols designed to protect the integrity of pending cases while ensuring that justice could continue to be administered despite the shocking revelations about one of the court's most senior members. Mitchell stood before a packed courtroom as she presented the formal criminal charges against Wellington to Magistrate Judge Samuel Rodriguez, who had been specially appointed to handle the case due to potential conflicts of interest among the MIG regular judicial roster. The indictment contained 47 separate counts, including conspiracy to obstruct justice, accepting bribes, witness intimidation, tax evasion, and racketeering under the federal RICO statute. Each charge carried significant prison time, and the cumulative effect would likely result in a life sentence for the man who had once commanded absolute respect in the federal legal community. The reading of the charges took over an hour as Mitchell methodically detailed each instance of corruption that federal investigators had documented over 3 years of exhaustive investigation. The courtroom gallery was filled with reporters, legal observers, and members of the public who had come to witness the unprecedented spectacle of a federal judge being formally accused of turning his courtroom into a criminal enterprise. Wellington sat at the defense table flanked by a team of white-collar criminal defense attorneys, his face ashen as the full scope of his criminal exposure became part of the official court record. The most dramatic moment of the arraignment came when Mitchell presented evidence that Wellington had attempted to have her assassinated when he realized that her investigation posed an existential threat to his operation. Federal wiretaps had captured conversations where Wellington discussed hiring professional criminals to eliminate the prosecutor who had become too dangerous to his continued survival. The assassination plot had been discovered and disrupted by federal agents, but the recordings provided chilling evidence of the lengths to which Wellington had been prepared to go to protect his corrupt empire. Blackstone's motion for bail was denied after Mitchell presented evidence that Wellington posed an ongoing danger to witnesses and had the financial resources to flee the country. The judge's secret offshore accounts contained over $12 million in assets that could easily fund his disappearance, while his documented history of witness intimidation made him an unacceptable risk for pretrial release. Wellington's transformation from a powerful federal judge to a detained criminal defendant was complete, and the symbolism of his orange jail uniform was not lost on the legal community that had once deferred to his authority. The ripple effects of Wellington's downfall spread throughout the federal judicial system as ethics committees launched comprehensive reviews of oversight procedures and internal controls designed to prevent similar corruption in the future. The Administrative Office of the United States Courts announced emergency reforms including mandatory financial disclosures, random audits of judicial decision-making patterns, and enhanced whistleblower protections for court personnel who reported suspicious activities. The scandal had exposed fundamental weaknesses in the system's ability to police itself, and the proposed reforms represented the most significant changes to judicial oversight in decades. District Attorney Michael Castellanos held a press conference announcing that his office would be reviewing over 800 cases that had been prosecuted in Wellington's court during the past decade, looking for evidence that corrupt judicial decisions had resulted in wrongful convictions or inappropriate sentences. The review process was expected to take years and cost millions of dollars, but Castellanos emphasized that restoring public trust in the justice system required a comprehensive examination of every case that might have been tainted by Wellington's criminal activities. The first wave of retrials began within weeks as defense attorneys filed successful motions arguing that their clients had been denied due process because of Wellington's systematic corruption. Maria Santos, who had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for drug trafficking, became the first defendant to have her conviction overturned when evidence emerged that Wellington had received payments from prosecution witnesses in exchange for favorable treatment. Her case became a symbol of the human cost of judicial corruption and sparked a broader conversation about the need for fundamental reforms to prevent similar abuses in the future. Federal Public Defender Lisa Chen announced that her office had identified over 300 potentially affected cases where defendants might have grounds for appeal based on Wellington's corrupt practices. The caseload represented a tsunami of litigation that would overwhelm the federal court system for years to come. But Chun argued that the constitutional guarantee of due process required a thorough review of every case that might have been compromised by judicial corruption. The financial and administrative burden of addressing Wellington's crimes would extend far beyond his individual prosecution. The investigation's reach expanded internationally when federal agents discovered that Wellington's corruption had attracted the attention of foreign criminal organizations who had paid substantial sums to ensure favorable treatment for their operatives in American courts. Drug cartels, money laundering operations, and international fraud syndicates had all benefited from Wellington's willingness to sell judicial decisions to the highest bidder. The revelation that foreign criminals had essentially purchased American justice through a corrupt federal judge prompted congressional investigations and diplomatic protests from countries whose citizens had been denied fair treatment in Wellington's court. Senator Elizabeth Harper, chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, announced emergency hearings to examine how Wellington's corruption had gone undetected for so long and what systemic changes were needed to prevent similar scandals in the future. The hearings would feature testimony from Mitchell, FBI investigators, and former court personnel who had witnessed suspicious activities but had been afraid to report them due to Wellington's reputation for retaliation. Harper characterized the scandal as a fundamental assault on the constitutional principle of equal justice under law and promised that her committee would recommend sweeping reforms to judicial oversight and accountability. The psychological impact on the legal community was profound as attorneys, judges, and court personnel struggled to comprehend How someone they had trusted and respected could have betrayed the fundamental principles of the judicial system so completely. Many lawyers who had appeared before Wellington were forced to examine their own professional relationships and consider whether they had unknowingly participated in or benefited from his corrupt practices. The scandal created a climate of suspicion and self-reflection that would influence the legal profession for years to come. Wellington's former law clerks found themselves under intense scrutiny as investigators examined whether they had knowledge of or participation in their mentor's criminal activities. Several clerks hired prominent defense attorneys as federal agents interviewed them about their observations of unusual patterns in case assignments, sentencing decisions, and financial arrangements. The clerks, who had once viewed their association with Wellington as a career-enhancing credential, now found themselves answering uncomfortable questions about their own potential criminal exposure. The first cooperation agreement was signed by Deputy Marshal Kevin Torres, who had provided Wellington's network with confidential security information about federal investigations and witness protection details. Torres had been facing decades in prison for his role in the conspiracy, but his detailed knowledge of the security breaches made him a valuable cooperating witness. His debriefing sessions revealed that Wellington's corruption had compromised federal law enforcement operations and endangered the lives of witnesses who had testified against organized crime figures. The media coverage of Wellington's downfall intensified as investigative journalists uncovered additional evidence of corruption that had not been included in the federal indictment. The Washington Post published a series of articles detailing how Wellington had used his judicial position to benefit business partners, political allies, and family members through favorable rulings and delayed prosecutions. The newspaper's investigation revealed that the scope of Wellington's corruption extended far beyond the criminal charges and included a pattern of ethical violations that had enriched him personally while betraying his oath of office. CNN aired a documentary examining the cultural and institutional factors that had enabled Wellington's corruption to flourish for so long without detection. The program featured interviews with legal experts, former prosecutors, and court personnel who described a system where questioning the decisions of senior federal judges was professionally discouraged and where whistleblowers faced career-ending retaliation. The documentary sparked national conversations about the need for greater transparency and accountability in the federal judiciary. The financial investigation revealed that Wellington's criminal enterprise had generated over $25 million in illicit profits through bribes, kickbacks, and fraudulent financial schemes. Forensic accountants traced the money flows through dozens of shell companies, offshore accounts, and legitimate business investments that Wellington had used to launder his criminal proceeds. The complexity of the financial arrangements demonstrated a level of sophistication that required professional assistance from accountants, lawyers, and financial advisors who were now facing their own criminal investigations. Asset forfeiture. Proceedings began immediately as federal prosecutors moved to seize Wellington's luxury properties, investment portfolios, and personal assets that had been purchased with criminal proceeds. The forfeiture actions would ultimately recover millions of dollars that would be used to compensate victims of Wellington's corruption and fund reforms to the judicial oversight system. The spectacle of federal agents seizing a sitting judge's assets provided powerful imagery that reinforced the message that no one was above the law. The international implications of the scandal became more apparent as foreign governments expressed concern about the integrity of American judicial proceedings involving their citizens. The European Union announced that it would review extradition treaties with the United States in light of evidence that foreign defendants might not have received fair treatment in American courts. The diplomatic fallout added another dimension to the crisis and increased pressure on American officials to implement meaningful reforms that would restore international confidence in the U.S. judicial system. Mitchell's role in exposing the Corruption earned her recognition as a profile in courage who had risked her career to pursue justice against overwhelming odds. Legal organizations honored her with awards for prosecutorial excellence and ethical leadership, while law schools invited her to speak about the importance of prosecutorial independence and the dangers of institutional corruption. Her willingness to confront a powerful federal judge, despite threats and intimidation, became a case study in moral courage that would be taught in legal ethics courses for generations. The psychological pressure on Wellington became unbearable. As he sat in federal detention awaiting trial while watching his life's work being systematically dismantled by the same justice system he had corrupted. The man who had once commanded absolute authority in his courtroom was now powerless to influence events as prosecutors, journalists, and congressional investigators exposed every aspect of his criminal enterprise. His attempts to maintain dignity through legal challenges and public statements only served to highlight the magnitude of his fall from grace. Defense attorney negotiations with federal prosecutors began in earnest as Blackstone explored the possibility of a plea agreement that might spare Wellington from a life sentence in exchange for his cooperation in ongoing investigations. The negotiations were complicated by Wellington's extensive criminal liability and the political pressure on prosecutors to seek maximum punishment for someone who had so thoroughly betrayed the public trust. Any plea agreement would require Wellington to admit to crimes that would result in decades of imprisonment and the forfeiture of virtually all his assets. The first congressional hearing on judicial oversight featured explosive testimony from FBI Director Rachel Thompson, who detailed the scope of the investigation and the challenges federal agents had faced in penetrating Wellington's criminal network. Thompson's testimony revealed that the investigation had required unprecedented resources and coordination between multiple federal agencies, and that similar corruption might exist in other federal districts. Her recommendations for systemic reforms included mandatory financial monitoring, enhanced background investigations, and stronger whistleblower protections. The cultural impact of the scandal extended beyond the legal profession, as the Wellington case became a symbol of institutional corruption and the importance of holding powerful individuals accountable, regardless of their position or influence. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for the prosecution and for broader reforms to increase transparency and accountability in government. The case had tapped into deep public frustration with perceived immunity for elite wrongdoing, and had demonstrated that determined prosecutors could still bring down corrupt officials despite their power and connections. Educational institutions began incorporating the Wellington scandal into their curricula as a case study in professional ethics, institutional corruption, and the importance of whistleblower protections. Business schools examined the case as an example of how organizational culture could enable systematic wrongdoing, while public policy programs used it to illustrate the challenges of oversight and accountability in government institutions. The scandal had become a teaching tool that would influence professional education for years to come. The trial preparation revealed additional evidence of Wellington's corruption as federal prosecutors interviewed hundreds of witnesses and reviewed thousands of documents that had been seized during the investigation. The evidence included detailed records of bribes, recordings of corrupt conversations, and testimony from co-conspirators who had agreed to cooperate with the government. The prosecution's case was so overwhelming that legal experts predicted that Wellington would be forced to plead guilty rather than face the certainty of conviction at trial. Religious and community leaders began speaking out about the moral dimensions of the scandal and the importance of ethical leadership in public institutions. Wellington had been a prominent member of his community, serving on charitable boards and speaking at civic events, but the revelation of his corruption had shattered the trust that community members had placed in him. The betrayal was particularly painful for those who had looked up to him as a role model and had defended him against earlier allegations of impropriety. The academic legal community launched a comprehensive examination of how judicial corruption could be prevented and detected more effectively in the future. Law schools organized symposiums and conferences devoted to judicial ethics and oversight, while legal scholars published articles analyzing the systemic failures that had enabled Wellington's corruption to flourish. The intellectual response to the scandal was aimed at ensuring that the lessons learned would lead to meaningful reforms, rather than cosmetic changes that failed to address underlying problems. Mitchell's vindication was complete when the Justice Department announced that she would be promoted to Assistant Attorney General in recognition of her exceptional work on the Wellington investigation. The promotion was widely seen as a signal that the federal government valued prosecutors who were willing to pursue difficult cases against powerful defendants, regardless of the personal and professional risks involved. Mitchell's career trajectory from a prosecutor facing intimidation to a senior Justice Department official became an inspirational story that encouraged other prosecutors to pursue corruption cases with similar determination. The final chapter of Wellington's downfall came when he agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence of 35 years in federal prison. The plea agreement required him to forfeit all assets purchased with criminal proceeds and to cooperate fully with ongoing investigations of other participants in the conspiracy. Wellington's statement to the court was brief and emotionless as he admitted to betraying his oath of office and corrupting the judicial system for personal gain. The man who had once been one of the most powerful judges in the federal system was now just another federal prisoner facing decades behind bars. The sentencing hearing was attended by dozens of victims whose lives had been affected by Wellington's corruption, including defendants who had been wrongfully convicted, attorneys whose careers had been damaged by his retaliation, and court personnel who had been intimidated into silence. Their victim impact statements provided powerful testimony about the human cost of judicial corruption and the importance of holding corrupt officials accountable for their crimes. Judge Rodriguez characterized Wellington's crimes as a fundamental assault on the rule of law and imposed the maximum sentence allowed under the plea agreement. The systemic reforms implemented in response to the Wellington scandal represented the most comprehensive overhaul of judicial oversight in decades. New monitoring systems were installed to detect patterns of suspicious judicial behavior, while enhanced financial disclosure requirements made it more difficult for judges to hide corrupt payments. Whistleblower protections were strengthened to encourage court personnel to report suspicious activities without fear of retaliation, and regular audits were instituted to review judicial decision-making patterns for evidence of bias or corruption. Years later, the Wellington scandal continued to influence American legal culture as law schools taught courses on prosecutorial courage and judicial accountability using Mitchell's investigation as a central case study. The scandal had demonstrated that even the most powerful individuals could be held accountable when determined prosecutors were willing to pursue the truth regardless of personal cost. Mitchell's legacy as a prosecutor who had refused to be intimidated by judicial authority became an inspiration for future generations of lawyers who would face similar challenges in their own careers. The restoration of public trust in the judicial system remained an ongoing process as courts worked to demonstrate that the reforms implemented after the Wellington scandal had effectively prevented similar corruption. Public opinion surveys showed gradual improvement in confidence in the federal judiciary, but the scandal's impact on institutional credibility would be felt for years to come. The case had served as a powerful reminder that democratic institutions were only as strong as the individuals who worked within them, and that constant vigilance was required to prevent corruption from taking root. The federal maximum security prison in Colorado, where Wellington would spend the remainder of his life, presented a stark contrast to the mahogany-paneled chambers where he had once wielded absolute power. The concrete walls, steel bars, and constant surveillance represented the ultimate consequence of his corrupt choices, while the orange jumpsuit that replaced his black judicial robes served as a daily reminder of how completely his world had collapsed. Wellington's fellow inmates showed little respect for his former position, viewing him as just another corrupt official who had betrayed the public trust for personal gain. Mitchell's work on the Wellington case had established her as one of the most respected prosecutors in the federal system, but she remained focused on the broader implications of the investigation rather than personal recognition. She testified before congressional committees examining judicial oversight reforms, spoke at law enforcement conferences about detecting institutional corruption, and worked with international organizations studying best practices for preventing judicial misconduct. Her expertise had become invaluable to lawmakers and administrators seeking to strengthen the systems designed to protect democratic institutions from corrupt influence. The investigative techniques that Mitchell's team had developed during the Wellington case became standard protocols for federal prosecutors handling public corruption cases. The methodical approach to financial analysis, the strategic use of surveillance technology, and the careful coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies had created a blueprint for investigating sophisticated criminal conspiracies that operated within government institutions. Training programs at the FBI Academy and federal prosecutor offices incorporated lessons learned from the Wellington investigation, ensuring that future corruption cases would benefit from the hard-won expertise that Mitchell's team had developed. Defense attorney Thomas Meridian's cooperation with federal investigators had provided crucial insights into how Wellington's network had operated. But his own career was effectively over despite his assistance to the government. The legal community viewed his involvement with Wellington's corrupt enterprise as an unforgivable betrayal of professional ethics, and state bar associations launched disciplinary proceedings that would likely result in his permanent disbarment. Meridian's fall from prominence served as a warning to other attorneys about the dangers of participating in judicial corruption, even in seemingly minor ways. The financial investigation had revealed that Wellington's corruption extended far beyond simple bribery to include sophisticated money laundering operations that had processed millions of dollars in criminal proceeds. The network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and legitimate business investments that Wellington had used to hide his illicit income required the assistance of financial professionals who were now facing their own criminal prosecutions. The scope of the financial conspiracy demonstrated how judicial corruption could create opportunities for other forms of white-collar crime. Federal agents working on the Wellington investigation had uncovered evidence of similar corruption in 3 other federal districts, leading to expanded investigations that threatened to expose a nationwide network of corrupt judicial officials. The preliminary evidence suggested that Wellington's operation was not unique, but part of a broader pattern of judicial misconduct that had infected multiple courts across the country. The revelation that judicial corruption might be more widespread than previously believed prompted the Justice Department to launch a comprehensive review of federal judicial oversight procedures. The psychological evaluation of Wellington, conducted by federal prison psychiatrists, revealed a complex personality profile that helped explain how a seemingly respected jurist could have engaged in such systematic criminal behavior. The evaluation showed that Wellington had developed a sense of entitlement and superiority that made him believe he was above the laws he was sworn to uphold. His corruption had begun gradually with minor ethical violations that escalated over time as he became comfortable with the idea that his position protected him from consequences. Court personnel who had worked under Wellington during his years of corrupt practices faced ongoing investigations and psychological counseling to address the trauma of discovering that their workplace had been a criminal enterprise. Many clerks, bailiffs, and administrative staff had witnessed suspicious activities, but had been afraid to report them due to Wellington's reputation for retaliation. The discovery that they had unknowingly participated in a corrupt system created feelings of guilt and betrayal that required professional intervention to address. The victims of Wellington's corruption organized a support group that met regularly to share their experiences and advocate for continued reforms to the judicial system. The group included wrongfully convicted defendants, attorneys who had been targeted for retaliation, and court personnel who had been intimidated into silence. Their advocacy efforts focused on ensuring that the reforms implemented after the Wellington scandal would be permanent rather than temporary responses to media attention. International law enforcement agencies began studying the Wellington case as an example of how judicial corruption could be detected and prosecuted effectively. The techniques that Mitchell's team had used to penetrate Wellington's criminal network were being adapted for use in other countries where judicial corruption was suspected but difficult to prove. The case had become a global reference point for prosecutors and investigators working to combat institutional corruption in democratic societies. The federal courthouse where Wellington had operated his corrupt enterprise underwent significant physical and procedural changes designed to prevent similar misconduct in the future. New security systems monitored judicial chambers and conference rooms to detect unauthorized meetings, while enhanced financial controls made it more difficult for judges to hide corrupt payments. The building itself had become a symbol of both the vulnerability of democratic institutions to corruption and the possibility of reform when wrongdoing was exposed. Wellington's family faced their own challenges as they struggled to cope with the public humiliation and financial devastation that resulted from his criminal prosecution. His wife and children had been unaware of his corrupt activities, but they bore the social stigma of his crimes and faced financial hardship after the government seized assets purchased with criminal proceeds. The collateral damage to innocent family members added another dimension to the human cost of judicial corruption. The academic study of the Wellington case had produced dozens of scholarly articles and several books examining different aspects of the scandal and its implications for democratic governance. Political scientists analyzed how institutional corruption could go undetected for so long, while legal scholars examined the adequacy of existing ethical rules and oversight mechanisms. The case had become a rich source of research material that would influence academic understanding of corruption and accountability for decades to come. Young prosecutors entering the federal system viewed Mitchell as a role model who had demonstrated the importance of moral courage in the pursuit of justice. Her willingness to confront powerful individuals despite personal risk had inspired a new generation of lawyers who were committed to holding corrupt officials accountable regardless of their position or influence. Law schools reported increased interest in public service careers among students who had studied the Wellington case and wanted to contribute to the fight against institutional corruption. The technology sector had responded to the Wellington scandal by developing new software systems designed to detect patterns of suspicious judicial behavior. These systems analyze judicial decisions, case assignments, and sentencing patterns to identify anomalies that might indicate corruption or bias. The technological solutions represented a new frontier in judicial oversight that complemented traditional investigative techniques with data analysis and artificial intelligence. Religious leaders who had known Wellington personally struggled to reconcile their previous positive impressions with the reality of his criminal behavior. Many had considered him a pillar of the community who contributed generously to charitable causes and spoke eloquently about justice and morality. The discovery that his public persona had been a facade designed to conceal systematic corruption challenged their understanding of human nature and the capacity for deception among seemingly virtuous individuals. The civil lawsuits filed by victims of Wellington's corruption had created a new category of legal practice as attorneys specialized in representing individuals who had been harmed by judicial misconduct. These cases presented unique challenges because they required plaintiffs to prove that judicial decisions had been influenced by corrupt considerations rather than legal merit. The litigation was expected to continue for years as courts worked to establish precedents for compensating victims of judicial corruption. Medical professionals who treated Wellington's stress-related health problems during his prosecution noted the severe physical toll that his downfall had taken on his body. The former judge had developed cardiovascular problems, sleep disorders, and anxiety conditions that reflected the psychological pressure of facing criminal prosecution and public humiliation. His medical condition served as a reminder that corruption extracted a price not only from victims, but also from perpetrators who eventually faced consequences for their actions. The media coverage of the Wellington scandal had evolved from sensational headlines about judicial corruption to thoughtful analysis of the systemic problems that had enabled such misconduct to flourish. Investigative journalists continued to examine other federal districts for signs of similar corruption, while editorial boards called for sustained attention to judicial oversight issues rather than treating them as temporary news stories. Case had demonstrated the important role that media scrutiny could play in exposing institutional corruption. Federal judges in other districts had implemented voluntary reforms designed to demonstrate their commitment to ethical conduct and transparent decision-making. Many judges began publishing more detailed explanations of their sentencing decisions, while others increased their participation in judicial education programs focused on ethics and accountability. The voluntary nature of these reforms reflected the profession's recognition that maintaining public trust required proactive efforts rather than merely avoiding obvious misconduct. The Wellington investigation had revealed weaknesses in the federal witness protection program that had been exploited by corrupt officials to intimidate potential witnesses. Reforms to the program included enhanced security protocols, improved communication procedures, and stronger penalties for officials who compromised witness safety. The changes were designed to ensure that future corruption investigations would not be hampered by concerns about witness intimidation. Prison officials who managed Wellington's incarceration noted that he remained largely isolated from other inmates and spent most of his time reading legal texts and writing what appeared to be memoirs or attempts at self-justification. His behavior in prison was generally compliant, but he showed little evidence of genuine remorse for his crimes or understanding of the harm he had caused to victims and to the judicial system as a whole. The psychological profile suggested that he continued to view himself as a victim of prosecutorial overreach, rather than a criminal who had betrayed his oath of office. The financial recovery efforts had succeeded in seizing and liquidating most of Wellington's assets, generating funds that were used to compensate victims and support judicial reform initiatives. The asset forfeiture process had required cooperation from financial institutions in multiple countries, demonstrating the international reach of modern corruption schemes and the need for enhanced coordination between law enforcement agencies. The recovered funds provided tangible evidence that corruption could be not only prosecuted, but also reversed through aggressive asset forfeiture actions. Community organizations that had received donations from Wellington's charitable foundation faced difficult decisions about whether to return the money or continue using it for legitimate charitable purposes. The legal and ethical complexities of handling donations that had been funded by criminal proceeds created new challenges for nonprofit organizations and their legal advisors. Many organizations ultimately decided to return the funds and seek support from other sources to avoid any association with corruption. The diplomatic implications of the Wellington scandal continued to influence international relations, as foreign governments expressed ongoing concerns about the integrity of American judicial proceedings. Several countries had requested assurances that their citizens would receive fair treatment in American courts, while others had begun implementing their own reforms to prevent similar corruption in their judicial systems. The case had become a cautionary tale that influenced international discussions about judicial integrity and democratic governance. Law enforcement training programs incorporated the Wellington case as a comprehensive example of how to investigate and prosecute complex corruption schemes that operate within government institutions. The case study format allowed trainees to examine investigative techniques, legal strategies, and the challenges of building cases against powerful defendants who had extensive resources and political connections. The training materials emphasized the importance of patience, thoroughness, and moral courage in pursuing difficult corruption cases. The psychological impact on the legal profession had been profound and lasting as attorneys, judges, and court personnel continued to grapple with questions about how such extensive corruption could have gone undetected for so long. Professional organizations had implemented new educational programs focused on recognizing and reporting signs of judicial misconduct, while bar associations had strengthened their disciplinary procedures to address attorney participation in corrupt schemes. The profession's response reflected a recognition that self-regulation required active vigilance rather than passive assumption that misconduct would be detected by others. Mitchell's subsequent career had focused on training prosecutors and investigators in techniques for detecting and prosecuting institutional corruption. Her expertise was sought by law enforcement agencies around the world, and she had become a leading voice in international efforts to combat judicial corruption. Her work demonstrated that the expertise gained from prosecuting one major corruption case could have far-reaching benefits for the global fight against institutional misconduct. The Wellington case had established new legal precedents for prosecuting judicial corruption, particularly in the use of RICO statutes to address systematic misconduct within government institutions. The successful prosecution had demonstrated that criminal conspiracy laws could be effectively applied to judicial corruption, providing prosecutors with powerful tools for addressing institutional misconduct that went beyond simple bribery. The legal precedents would influence future prosecutions and help ensure that corrupt officials could not escape accountability by claiming that their actions fell outside traditional criminal categories. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.